The last time I saw that antique silver hairpin, it was locked in an evidence box right before the judge destroyed my life. My sister sobbed in the gallery. Arthur held her hand. I died in a cold cell, forgotten coughing my lungs out on a concrete floor. Then I open my eyes. The gala music is playing. The night is young. The silver pin rests heavy in my palm. I smiled, turned to my sister, and slid it gently into her curls. Enjoy the spotlight, Chloe. The scent of white orchids and spilled gin hit me first. It was a sharp, suffocating combination that belonged entirely to the past. My lungs expanded, pulling in a ragged, desperate breath. Air, clean, conditioned air, free of the damp rot and rust of the penitentiary. My fingers spasmed. Instead of coarse wool and cold iron, they found smooth, heavy silk. I blinked against the harsh glare of a massive crystal chandelier. I was standing in the grand foyer of the Beaumont Hotel. The low, rhythmic thrum of a string quartet playing a classical arrangement of a pop song vibrated through the floorboards. Men in tailored tuxedos and women wrapped in designer gowns milled around me, laughing with their teeth and never their eyes. I looked down at my hands. There were no calluses, no fading bruises around my wrists. My nails were perfectly manicured, painted a pale, unassuming pink. I was 22 again. Panic and adrenaline fought a quick, brutal war in my chest. I pressed a hand to my sternum, feeling the frantic rabbit kick of my heart. I remembered the cell. I remembered the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the sharp pain in my chest that the prison doctor prescribed ibuprofen for until it was too late. I remembered the final hollow realization that no one was coming for me. And yet, here I was, the annual Founders Gala, the night my life ended the first time. Clara, are you even listening to me? The voice was high-sweet and laced with that familiar grating edge of entitlement. I turned slowly. Chloe, my younger sister. She stood there in a breathtaking emerald gown that our father had bought her, pouting perfectly. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders. Her skin was flawless. She looked exactly as she had the day of my sentencing, only without the practiced crocodile tears. "My feet are killing me," Chloe complained, shifting her weight. "And Arthur hasn't even looked my way yet. You said he'd be here." Arthur. Just hearing his name sent a shock wave of cold nausea through my stomach. Arthur Pendleton, the heir to the Pendleton Empire, the man who had kissed my forehead, promised me the world, and then quietly forged my signature on 20 different offshore shell company documents. I forced my facial muscles to relax. I needed to breathe. I needed to play the game. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and offered my sister a faint, polished smile. "He's here," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Too smooth, too young. "Patience, Chloe." Right on cue, the crowd parted slightly. Arthur walked through the gap. He was objectively handsome, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair swept neatly back and a smile that seemed designed to put people at ease. It was a predator's smile. I saw it now. The way his eyes darted around the room, assessing threats, calculating net worths, hunting for the weakest link. In my past life, my heart had fluttered when those eyes landed on me. Tonight, my stomach just turned over in disgust. He approached us, holding a small velvet box in his left hand. "The trap." "Clara." Arthur set his voice, a low, rich baritone. He didn't even glance at Chloe, which I knew was driving her insane. He stopped right in front of me, invading my personal space. "You look stunning tonight. As always." "Arthur, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. He popped the velvet box open. Resting on a bed of black satin was the silver falcon hairpin, the Pendleton family crest. To the high society vultures watching us from the edges of the room, this was a proposal. It was the ultimate mark of favor. Arthur choosing the quiet older sister over the flashy golden child, younger sister. "My grandmother wanted you to wear this tonight," Arthur said softly, holding the box out to me. "It belongs to the future of this family. I want everyone to know where my loyalties lie." In the previous timeline, I had blushed. I had let him slide the heavy silver pin into my dark hair. I had worn it like a crown, completely unaware that it was actually a target. The hairpin was the public declaration of our partnership. When the feds raided his offices 48 hours later, Arthur told them I was the financial mastermind, the quiet, calculating heiress pulling the strings, the hairpin, the photos of us together, the forged documents. It all painted a perfect picture of a greedy woman manipulating a wealthy family. I looked at the silver falcon. Its tiny ruby eyes seemed to mock me. I reached out and took the pin from the velvet box. Arthur's smile widened, triumphant and secure. He thought he had me. He thought I was just another stupid, naive girl, desperate for validation. "It's beautiful, Arthur," I murmured, turning the cold metal over in my fingers. I could feel the weight of it, the weight of 10 years in a concrete box, the weight of a stolen life. I turned toward Chloe. She was staring at the pin, her jaw tight, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated envy. She wanted it. She wanted the money, the prestige, the spotlight. She had always hated me for getting Arthur's attention. She had happily testified against me to secure her own safety. "But I think," I said, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by the surrounding sycophants, "that it suits Chloe much better." Before either of them could react, I stepped forward and slid the heavy silver falcon deep into Chloe's intricate blonde curls. I made sure it was secure. I patted her shoulder, stepping back to admire my handiwork. Chloe gasped, her hands flying up to touch the silver piece. Her face flushed with sudden, overwhelming victory. She looked at Arthur, practically glowing. Arthur froze. His perfectly constructed smile cracked for a fraction of a second. The script had changed. He looked at me, confusion flashing in his dark eyes. "Clara," he started. "She's the one who truly appreciates the Pendleton legacy," I interrupted, smiling pleasantly. "And green is definitely her color. The silver sets it off perfectly. Don't you agree, Arthur?" Chloe beamed at him, stepping into the space I had just vacated. "Oh, Arthur, thank you. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The whispers began immediately. The crowd loved a pivot. The older sister stepping aside for the younger. The drama, the scandal. I took a slow step backward, melting into the periphery. My heart was no longer racing. It was beating with a slow, steady, absolute certainty. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Enjoy the silver falcon, little sister. The rest of the gala was a blur of champagne glasses and suffocating perfume, but I watched it all from the shadows, with the clinical detachment of a mortician. Chloe paraded around the ballroom like a newly crowned queen. She made sure to angle her head just right every time a photographer snapped a picture for the society pages, ensuring the silver falcon caught the light. People clustered around her, offering hollow congratulations and sizing her up. She drank it in. She thrived on it. Arthur remained by her side, though his posture was incredibly stiff. Every so often, his eyes would dart over the heads of the crowd, searching for me. I made sure I was always just out of reach, half hidden behind a marble pillar, or deep in conversation with a deaf elderly aunt whose name I couldn't remember. He was panicked. I could see the subtle tightening of his jaw. He needed my signature on the asset transfer documents tonight. I was the one with the clean, unmonitored trust fund. Chloe's accounts were heavily supervised by our father because of her gambling debts, a detail Arthur had overlooked in his initial scouting. I checked my watch. 11:45 p.m. I slipped out of the ballroom and headed for the quiet sanctuary of the hotel's upper-level suites. In the previous life, Arthur had pulled me into one of these empty rooms, poured me a glass of vintage wine, and whispered sweet nothings while sliding a stack of prenuptial agreements across the mahogany desk. I walked into suite 402. The room was dark, lit only by the neon glow of the city skyline, bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked over to the minibar, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and waited. 5 minutes later, the door clicked open. Arthur slipped inside, loosening his bow tie. He let out an exasperated sigh before he even saw me. "Arthur," I said. From the armchair in the corner, he jumped, his hand flying to his chest. "Jesus, Clara, you startled me." He recovered quickly, pasting that predatory charm back onto his face as he walked toward me. "I've been looking for you all night. Why did you run off? And why did you give the pin to Chloe?" He sat on the edge of the desk, trying to loom over me, trying to establish dominance. I just took a slow sip of my water. "Chloe wanted it," I said simply. "And frankly, Arthur, I'm exhausted. The social climbing, the posturing. She's built for it. I'm not. But I chose you," he murmured, leaning in close. His cologne smelled like cedar and lies. "Clara, you know we're meant to build a future together. I have some paperwork tonight. Just formalities for the new trust we talked about. We can bypass all this noise." "I can't sign anything, Arthur." His eyes hardened instantly. "What do you mean, my father?" I lied, my voice dropping into a convincing, ashamed whisper. "He caught wind of the trust. He locked down my accounts this morning. Total freeze. I don't even have signatory power over my own dividends right now." Arthur stood up sharply. The charm evaporated, leaving behind something cold and furious. "He locked them. For how long? Months? Maybe a year. He thinks I'm too irresponsible." I looked up at him, projecting absolute innocence. "But Chloe just had her trust released last week. Father gave her full control as an early birthday present. It was a massive gamble. I knew for a fact our father hadn't released Chloe's trust, but Chloe was desperate enough to lie to Arthur and arrogant enough to forge our father's secondary signature if she thought it would secure her marriage to the Pendleton heir. Arthur stared at the skyline, his mind working furiously. The raid was coming in 2 days. He needed a scapegoat with an open, wealthy account to dump the toxic assets into immediately. He didn't have time to vet my lie. He only had time to pivot. "I see," Arthur said smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. The mask slid back into place. "Well, family politics are always complicated. Don't worry about the paperwork, Clara. We'll figure it out." "You're not mad?" I asked, widening my eyes. "Never at you," he lied effortlessly. "Excuse me, I should probably go check on your sister. She's representing my family's crest tonight after all." He practically bolted from the room. I stayed in the armchair for a long time, listening to the silence. I had done it. I had diverted the train off my tracks and sent it barreling straight toward the two people who had tied me to the rails. I left the hotel through the service elevator, avoiding the lingering press at the front doors. The night air was cool and sharp against my face. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address to my private apartment, not the family estate. When I unlocked my door, I didn't go to sleep. I dragged a suitcase out from under my bed and started packing. Sweaters, practical shoes, cash I had hidden in a hollowed-out book. I booted up my laptop and began meticulously severing my digital footprint from the family servers. I drafted a brief, legally binding letter, resigning from the board of our father's holding company, backdating it by 2 weeks, and sending it directly to my personal attorney with strict instructions to file it at dawn. I worked through the night, fueled by black coffee and the cold, burning memory of a prison cell. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the city skyline in bruised shades of purple and orange, I was done. I stood by my window, holding a hot mug, looking out over the waking streets. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Chloe. Arthur and I signed the partnership papers. We're officially a team. He says we're moving assets to our joint account this morning. Dad is going to be so mad, but I don't care. I win, Clara. I finally win. I stared at the glowing screen. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It reached my eyes this time. You sure did, sis, I whispered to the empty room. I deleted the message, turned off the phone, and dropped it into the trash can. Far away, breaking through the quiet morning hum of the city, I heard the faint, rising wail of police sirens. The television screen cast a pale blue light across my living room. I sat on the edge of the sofa, nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. I didn't turn the volume up. I didn't need to hear the breathless, frantic voices of the morning anchors. I knew the script by heart. The banner at the bottom of the screen flashed in bright red blocks: FBI raids, Pendleton Holdings. Heir apparent detained. Helicopter footage showed the sleek, glass-fronted skyscraper of Arthur's corporate headquarters. Dozens of agents in Navy windbreakers were swarming the plaza. They carried out cardboard boxes filled with hard drives, ledger books, and the crushed remnants of Arthur's empire. The camera zoomed in just as a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Arthur emerged flanked by federal agents. His hands were cuffed behind his back. The custom Italian suit he had worn at the gala was rumpled. His hair, usually slicked into a perfect predatory shell, hung limply over his forehead. He looked small. I took a slow sip of the cold coffee. It tasted like ash and victory. In my previous life, I had been the one dragged out of that building. I remembered the blinding flashes of the paparazzi cameras, the shouting reporters shoving microphones in my face, asking how I could steal millions from honest investors. I remembered looking back at Arthur, who stood safely behind the police line, giving me a look of practiced tragic betrayal. Now, he was the one looking around frantically, his eyes darting toward the cameras. He was looking for someone to blame. The broadcast cut abruptly to a second location. My breath caught slightly in my throat. It was the Beaumont family estate, my childhood home. The massive wrought iron gates were pushed wide open, and an identical fleet of black government vehicles crowded the circular driveway. The anchor's voice leaked thinly from the speakers. Simultaneous raid at the residence of socialite Chloe Beaumont, who was reportedly named a primary partner in several newly formed Pendleton offshore trusts late last night. The front doors of the estate swung open. Two agents walked out holding my sister by her arms. Chloe wasn't wearing designer silk today. She was wearing sweatpants and an oversized cashmere sweater, her blonde hair tangled around her face. She was screaming. Even without the volume, I could see the shape of the words tearing out of her throat. She was fighting them, digging her heels into the expensive, imported gravel. Our father Richard stood on the front steps. He was wearing his silk robe, his face flushed, a dangerous, apoplectic purple. He wasn't stepping forward to help her. He was yelling at the agents, waving a piece of paper, probably a warrant, while visibly trying to distance himself from his favorite daughter. Chloe turned back to him, pleading. I could see the exact moment her panic mutated into terror. Our father turned his back and walked inside, letting the heavy oak doors slam shut. I closed my eyes. The phantom ache of a concrete floor pressed against my spine, a lingering ghost of the past. I had begged Richard, too. Through the thick plexiglass of the visitation room, I had begged him to hire a forensic accountant to look at the forged signatures. He had looked at me with cold, flat disgust and told me I was a parasite. He had cut me off completely, leaving me to rely on a public defender who couldn't tell a shell company from a seashell. I opened my eyes and set the mug down. The pity I expected to feel for my sister never materialized. She had signed the papers eagerly. She had wanted to steal my life. I just let her have it. My secure, untraceable landline rang. I walked into the kitchen and picked it up. Clara, came the dry, gravelly voice of Harrison, my personal attorney. I had hired him 3 weeks ago, using a private account I set up the day I woke up in this timeline. He was old, sharp, and ruthless. Are you watching the circus? I am Harrison. Your father's general counsel just called me. Harrison said, a hint of dark amusement in his tone. They are frantically looking for you. It seems Arthur Pendleton moved $80 million of toxic debt into a newly registered partnership account at 2 a.m. The account bears the signatures of Arthur Pendleton and Chloe Beaumont. It also bypassed the standard trust restrictions because Chloe somehow produced a document bearing your father's secondary authorization. Forgery, I said softly. Sloppy forgery, Harrison corrected. The feds froze the Beaumont family accounts 10 minutes ago. Richard is legally tied to the blast radius. He is currently bleeding money and reputation by the second. They want to know where you are. They want to know if your accounts are accessible to bail Chloe out and secure a defense team. And what did you tell them? I told them my client legally severed all financial and administrative ties to the Beaumont estate a month ago, Harrison said smoothly. I sent them the time-stamped resignation letters and the bank transfer receipts, proving your personal trust was relocated to an independent institution. You are a ghost, Clara, legally, financially, and professionally. The feds have no reason to look at you, and your father has no legal mechanism to touch your money. A heavy, profound silence settled over the kitchen. The suffocating weight I had carried since the moment I woke up in this second life finally lifted off my chest. Thank you, Harrison. Don't thank me yet, he warned. Arthur is a cornered rat, and your sister is entirely unprepared for a federal interrogation room. They will both try to point the finger at you. The FBI will want to speak with you eventually. You were, until very recently, Arthur's public companion. Let them come, I said, staring out the window at the distant city skyline. I have nothing to hide. Good. Stay in the apartment. Order takeout. Don't speak to the press. He hung up. I placed the receiver back on the cradle. I walked back into the living room and finally turned the television off. The silence was absolute. I sank into the cushions and pulled a throw blanket over my legs, feeling completely, wonderfully safe. 3 days later, the dust hadn't settled. It had only morphed into a suffocating smog that choked the city's elite. I sat in a sterile, windowless conference room inside the federal building downtown. The air conditioning hummed a low rattling tune. Harrison sat to my right, calmly reviewing a stack of manila folders. Across the metal table sat Agent Foster. She was a tired-looking woman in her late 40s, with sharp, assessing eyes, in a cheap polyester suit. She had a pen clicking rhythmically between her fingers. In my past life, Foster had been the one to break me. She had slammed her hands on the table, shown me photos of Arthur's forged ledgers, and yelled until my ears rang, demanding to know where I hid the money. I had cried until I vomited. Today, I sat with my back perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I wore a modest navy blouse and slacks. I looked like a responsible, boring, estranged daughter. "Let's go over this one more time. Miss Beaumont," Foster said, stopping the clicking pen. "You dated Arthur Pendleton for 6 months. You attended corporate dinners. You were widely considered his confidant. We casually dated Agent Foster." I corrected my voice, polite and steady. I wouldn't use the word confidant. Arthur enjoyed having a quiet audience. I mostly listened. Right. But at the Founders Gala, just hours before the raid, he presented you with a family heirloom, a silver falcon hairpin. That's a highly publicized commitment in your social circle. Yet 20 minutes later, witnesses say you pinned it on your younger sister. Foster leaned forward, searching my face for a crack. Why? Because Arthur and my sister had been having an affair behind my back. I lied smoothly. I didn't blink. I didn't break eye contact. I found out a few days prior. I didn't want to make a public scene and humiliate my family, so I simply handed her the pin. I stepped aside. It seemed like the cleanest way to end things. Foster frowned, glancing down at her notes. "You're saying Arthur's pivot to Chloe was personal, not financial." Harrison cleared his throat. "Agent Foster, my client's personal life is not a federal matter. What is a matter of record is that Clara Beaumont resigned from all family boards and transferred her assets to a blind trust 4 weeks ago. She has no financial ties to Arthur Pendleton. Her signature is nowhere near the offshore accounts. Her alibi is airtight, supported by timestamps and bank executives. Chloe Beaumont is claiming you orchestrated the entire transfer." Foster countered, looking back at me. "She says you forced her to sign those documents in the hotel suite. She says you forged your father's signature to unlock the trust." I let out a slow, deliberate breath. I allowed a look of profound, tragic disappointment to wash over my face. I looked down at my hands. "My sister," I said, my voice trembling just a fraction, "has always struggled with accountability. Our father indulges her. When she gambled away her allowance, he paid it quietly. When she wanted Arthur, she took him. And now that she has signed away millions of dollars into a fraudulent shell company to impress a man, she is looking for someone else to take the blame." I looked up, meeting Foster's hard eyes. "I feel deeply sorry for her, Agent, but I am not going to prison for her mistakes." Foster stared at me for a long, silent moment. She was a human lie detector, and she was looking for the scared, guilty girl that Arthur had painted me to be. But that girl was dead. She had died on a concrete floor 10 years in the future. The woman sitting across from her had nothing to hide because she hadn't left a single fingerprint on the weapon. Foster tossed her pen onto the table. "Arthur is singing a different tune," Foster muttered, almost to herself. "He's claiming Chloe completely deceived him. He says she presented herself as the sole heir to the Beaumont fortune and aggressively pushed for the asset merger. He says he was a victim of her manipulation." A sharp thrill shot down my spine. The rats were eating each other in the dark. "As I said," Harrison interjected, snapping his briefcase shut. "My client is entirely removed from this mess. Unless you are formally charging her agent Foster, we are leaving." Foster sighed, rubbing her temples. "You're free to go, Miss Beaumont. Don't leave the state." I stood up, smoothing the front of my slacks. "Thank you for your time, Agent." I walked out of the federal building with Harrison by my side. The bright afternoon sun hit my face, warming my skin. It was a beautiful day. "They won't bother you again," Harrison said quietly as we reached the street corner. "Arthur's lawyers are tearing Chloe apart to save him. Your father's lawyers are tearing Arthur apart to save the estate. You are officially irrelevant." "Irrelevant," I repeated. It was the most beautiful word I had ever heard. "There is a bail hearing for your sister in an hour," Harrison noted, adjusting his briefcase. "Given the flight risk and the sheer volume of missing capital, the judge is heavily favored to deny it. Your father is refusing to put up the estate as collateral. Are you going?" I paused on the sidewalk. I pictured the courtroom. I pictured the hard wooden benches, the smell of floor wax, and fear. I pictured the exact spot where I had stood shivering and alone while the judge brought the gavel down on my life. "Yes," I said, my voice hardening. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B felt exactly the same beneath my fingertips. I pushed them open and stepped into the chilled, stale air. The smell hit me instantly, a suffocating cocktail of lemon wood polish, damp wool, and the sour tang of nervous sweat. My chest tightened automatically. My body remembered this room perfectly. It remembered the rigid discomfort of the wooden defense chair. It remembered the blinding glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. But today, I didn't walk past the wooden railing. I took a seat in the second row of the gallery, sliding in next to a journalist furiously typing on a tablet. I folded my hands in my lap. I breathed in, forcing my lungs to expand fully. The room was packed. The Pendleton scandal had exploded across the morning news cycle, dragging the Beaumont name right down into the mud with it. The gallery hummed with whispered gossip and the quiet scratching of pens. A side door clicked open. The dull, rhythmic clinking of metal chains bled into the room. My breath hitched. I knew that sound. I felt it rattle in the marrow of my bones. Chloe walked in, first, led by a bailiff. She was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. It hung off her small frame, violently bright, under the harsh lights. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, secured by a belly chain. Her blonde hair, normally a masterpiece of salon engineering, was a greasy, tangled mess pressed flat against her skull. She looked terrified. Her eyes darted wildly around the gallery, searching, pleading. Then, Arthur was brought in through the opposite door. He wore a matching jumpsuit, but he carried it differently. He was trying to maintain his posture, trying to project the arrogant authority of a CEO, but the shackles ruined the effect. He just looked like a man drowning in a very shallow pool. They were seated at separate tables. The hostility between them was a living, breathing thing. Arthur wouldn't even look at her. Chloe glared at him with an absolute venomous hatred. The partnership was dead. Judge Higgins took the bench. He was an older man with a severe face and no patience for the theatrics of the wealthy. We are here for the preliminary bail hearing of Arthur Pendleton and Chloe Beaumont. Judge Higgins announced, his voice booming through the microphone. Given the overlapping nature of the federal charges, conspiracy, wire fraud, and the unauthorized transfer of $80 million, we are handling this jointly. Arthur's lawyer stood up first. He was a shark in a $5,000 suit, a man whose hourly rate probably exceeded my first trust fund dividend. Your Honor, my client is a victim of aggressive manipulation. The lawyer began smoothly. He was deceived by Miss Beaumont, who falsely represented her financial authority within her family's estate. She provided forged documents to bypass security protocols. Mr. Pendleton believed he was entering a legitimate merger with the Beaumont family. He is not a flight risk. We request bail be set at $2 million, secured by his mother's remaining property. Chloe let out a choked, hysterical noise. Her court-appointed attorney, a frazzled man who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, placed a restraining hand on her arm. That is absurd, Your Honor. Chloe's lawyer stammered, standing up. Miss Beaumont is 20 years old. She has no background in finance. Mr. Pendleton orchestrated this entire shell company. He used her affection to trick her into signing those documents in a hotel room late at night. She didn't even read them. She read them enough to forge her father's secondary authorization. The federal prosecutor interjected dryly from the third table. Your Honor, $80 million is currently unaccounted for, routed through servers we are still trying to crack. Both defendants possess the means and the connections to flee the country. We strongly oppose bail for either party. I watched Chloe. She was crying, now ugly, heaving sobs that shook her shoulders. She turned in her chair, looking desperately into the gallery. She was looking for our father. But Richard wasn't there. He was back at the estate, frantically trying to stop the bleeding of his own accounts. Then Chloe's eyes found mine. She froze. The tears continued to spill down her cheeks, but her expression shifted. Through the terror and the panic, a flicker of pure, confused betrayal crossed her face. She remembered the hotel room. She remembered me handing her the silver falcon. She remembered me telling her that she was the one who truly appreciated the Pendleton legacy. I didn't break eye contact. I didn't smile, and I didn't frown. I just looked at her with the cold, immovable detachment of a stranger. I gave her a single, slow nod. You wanted my life. You have it. Chloe opened her mouth, a silent scream, dying in her throat, just as Judge Higgins banged his gavel. The sharp, violent crack echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Given the severity of the charges, the overwhelming evidence of document forgery, and the missing capital, Judge Higgins declared, his voice cutting through the noise. I find both defendants to be a significant flight risk. Bail is denied. Both parties will be remanded to federal custody pending trial. The gavel fell a second time. It was the sound of a closing casket. The bailiffs moved in. Chloe collapsed against the table, her legs giving out. The guards had to haul her up by her armpits. Arthur stood up mechanically, his face drained of all color, staring blankly at the polished wooden desk. I stayed in my seat until they were both led out the side doors. The heavy metal locks clicked shut, sealing them inside a nightmare I had already survived. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt, and walked out into the sunlight. The air in my apartment lobby was climate-controlled and smelled faintly of eucalyptus. It was a sharp contrast to the grime of the federal courthouse. I pushed through the revolving glass doors, my mind quiet, my shoulders light. Then I saw him. Richard Beaumont was sitting on a velvet bench near the concierge desk. He looked atrocious. He was wearing yesterday's suit. His tie was loose, and the skin around his eyes was bruised with exhaustion. He looked 10 years older than he had at the gala. He stood up the second he saw me, his posture instantly straightening into the commanding, authoritative stance he used in boardrooms. He expected me to flinch. He expected me to bow. "Clara!" He barked, his voice echoing slightly in the marble lobby. The concierge looked up alarmed, but I waved a hand gently to signal I was fine. I walked over to him, stopping a few feet out of reach. "Hello, Richard." He winced at the use of his first name. "Where the hell have you been?" "Your phone is disconnected. Harrison won't return my calls. Do you have any idea what is happening to our family?" "I have a fairly good idea," I replied calmly. "I watched the bail hearing this morning. The feds are thorough." Richard ran a hand over his face, a gesture of deep, theatrical distress. "Chloe is in a cage. The FBI tore apart my home. They froze the primary estate accounts because that idiot sister of yours forged my signature on a transfer document. The board is calling an emergency meeting to vote me out by Friday." He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a gravelly, urgent whisper. "I need your trust, Clara. It's the only liquid capital the feds haven't locked down. Harrison transferred it out before the raid. I need you to wire $15 million to the Caymans by tonight, so I can hire a crisis firm and a real defense team to unfreeze my domestic assets." He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't ask if I was safe. He just needed the money. He needed the backup generator to kick in because his primary power source had failed. In the previous timeline, I had called him from a prison payphone. I had begged him to believe me. I had told him Arthur framed me. Richard had listened in cold silence, and then he had said, "You humiliated this family. Do not call this number again." I looked at him now, feeling absolutely nothing. The phantom tether that had tied me to this man, the desperate need for a father's approval, was gone. It had burned to ash a long time ago. "No," I said quietly. Richard stopped. He blinked as if I had spoken a foreign language. "What did you say?" I said no. I severed my trust from the family estate, legally and permanently. That money belongs to me. I'm not giving you a dime. His face darkened, the familiar violent rage bubbling to the surface. "You ungrateful little brat. I gave you that money. I put a roof over your head. Your sister is sitting in federal lockup, and you are going to let this family burn." "She isn't my sister," I said, my voice steady, cutting through his anger like a scalpel. "And you aren't my family. You're just a man who shares my last name, a man who sat back and watched Arthur Pendleton treat me like a pawn until Chloe decided she wanted the pawn's place. You don't understand how the world works, Clara." Richard spat, stepping into my personal space, trying to physically intimidate me. "If I go down the Beaumont, name is entirely ruined. You will be nothing. I am already nothing to you." I countered, looking him dead in the eyes. I didn't step back. "I was always nothing to you. Chloe was the golden child. She was the one you wanted to run the empire. Well, look at her now. She partnered with a thief, and she signed her own death warrant." That's your legacy, Richard. You built her. He raised a hand, his fingers curling into a fist. His face was purple with rage. Do it, I whispered, leaning in slightly. Hit me in front of the concierge. Give the press another headline for the evening news. Disgraced CEO assaults eldest daughter in luxury lobby. Let's see how the board reacts to that. His arm trembled. He looked at my face, realizing for the very first time that he had absolutely no power over me. The fear was gone. The submission was gone. I was staring at him like a judge, staring at a guilty man. Slowly, his arm dropped to his side. He looked suddenly frail, a hollowed-out shell of a patriarch. You planned this. He breathed a look of horrifying realization dawning in his eyes. You gave her that hairpin. You stepped aside. You knew the feds were coming. I survived. I corrected him simply. I stepped off the tracks. What you and Chloe did with the oncoming train is entirely your own fault. I turned my back on him. I didn't wait for his response. I walked toward the private elevators, swiping my keycard on the security scanner. Clara! He yelled, his voice cracking, desperate now. Clara, please. I stepped into the elevator. The polished steel doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of his begging. The cab shot upward, pulling me higher, leaving the wreckage of the Beaumont legacy buried far beneath the ground. November arrived with a bitter biting wind that stripped the city bare. The trees turned skeletal. The sky remained a bruised, unforgiving gray. It was the perfect backdrop for a public execution. The trial of Arthur Pendleton and Chloe Beaumont dominated every news channel, every newspaper, and every whispered conversation in the financial district. The prosecution moved with terrifying speed. They had the paper trail, they had the forged signatures, and they had the offshore bank records. All they needed was a narrative to tie the dry financial data to the human greed that fueled it. That was why I was subpoenaed. I didn't enter the courthouse through the front doors. Harrison arranged for me to use the secure underground entrance, reserved for judges and high-risk witnesses. I sat in a small, windowless waiting room with him for 2 hours, drinking tepid water from a paper cup. I wasn't nervous. My pulse was a slow, steady drumbeat. I had already lived through the worst thing that could ever happen to me. Speaking into a microphone was nothing. They are going to try to rattle you, Harrison said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed his notes. Arthur's defense attorney, specifically. He needs to paint you as the mastermind. He needs the jury to believe you set Arthur up to take the fall because you were a scorned lover. Let him try, I replied, crushing the paper cup in my hand and tossing it into the trash. When the bailiff finally called my name, I followed him down the long, carpeted hallway and into the courtroom. The sheer volume of people in the gallery was staggering. Every wooden bench was packed. Sketch artists sat in the front row. The air was thick and hot-smelling of cheap cologne and nervous anticipation. I kept my eyes locked on the witness stand as I walked past the wooden railing, ignoring the frantic flashing of a camera from a rogue journalist who had smuggled a phone inside. I placed my hand on the Bible. I swore to tell the truth. I sat down. Only then did I look at the defense tables. Arthur looked like a ghost. He had lost at least 15 pounds. His bespoke suit hung off his frame like a sack. The terrifying predatory confidence that had defined him was entirely gone, replaced by a twitching, paranoid energy. He gnawed on his lower lip, his eyes darting wildly. Chloe was worse. She sat slumped in her chair, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, harsh ponytail that highlighted the dark sunken circles under her eyes. The golden girl of the Beaumont family had tarnished. She didn't look at me. She just stared at her hands, which were trembling violently in her lap. The lead prosecutor, a tall, sharp-featured man named Thomas, approached the podium. "Miss Beaumont," Thomas began, his voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "Thank you for being here. I want to direct your attention to the night of October 14th, the annual Founders Gala. You attended this event with Arthur Pendleton, correct?" "Yes, I did," I answered. My voice was calm, carrying easily through the microphone. "And during this event, did Mr. Pendleton present you with a piece of jewelry? A silver falcon hairpin representing his family crest?" "He did. But you didn't keep it, did you?" Thomas asked, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "Witnesses state you immediately gave it to your younger sister, Chloe Beaumont. Why?" I let a moment of silence stretch out. I looked directly at the jury. 12 ordinary people. "Because I knew they were involved," I said smoothly. The lie tasted like absolute truth. Arthur and Chloe had been seeing each other behind my back. I noticed the glances. I heard the whispered phone calls. When Arthur tried to publicly claim me with that hairpin, I found it hypocritical. I stepped aside. I gave the pin to Chloe because she was the one he actually wanted, and she was the one who wanted his lifestyle. A loud murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge banged his gavel, once restoring order. "Objection!" Arthur's lawyer shouted, leaping to his feet. "Speculation. The witness has no proof of a prior romantic relationship." "I'll rephrase," Thomas said smoothly, before the judge could rule. "Miss Beaumont, after you gave your sister the hairpin, what happened?" "And they left the ballroom together," I said. And the following morning, I received a text message from Chloe stating that she and Arthur had officially signed partnership papers and were merging their assets. She seemed incredibly happy. Thomas submitted the printed screenshot of Chloe's text message into evidence. It was the nail in the coffin. It established premeditation. It established her willing, eager participation. When it was time for cross-examination, Arthur's lawyer approached me like a feral dog. He slammed his hands on the podium. "Miss Beaumont, isn't it true that you were furious?" he demanded, his voice echoing sharply. "Isn't it true that you engineered this entire financial transfer out of spite? You forged your father's signature to unlock Chloe's trust, and you framed my client." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned slightly toward the microphone. "I have my own trust fund, sir," I said, my tone laced with a gentle, pitying condescension. "A trust fund that is fully accounted for and was legally separated from my family weeks before Arthur's office was raided. I didn't need my father's money. I didn't need Arthur's money. And I certainly didn't need a man who forged ledgers for a living. I left the gala and went to sleep. What they did in the dark is their own burden to bear." I looked at Arthur. He shrank back in his chair, his eyes dropping to the floor. He had nothing. His lawyer blustered for another 10 minutes, but the jury had already stopped listening to him. They were looking at me. They saw a calm, collected woman who had narrowly escaped a disaster. "No further questions," the lawyer finally muttered, defeated. "You may step down, Miss Beaumont," Judge Higgins said. I stood up. I walked down the short wooden steps and straight down the center aisle of the courtroom. I didn't look back. The air in the hallway outside was cold and clean. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs entirely. I was free. The jury deliberated for barely 48 hours. $80 million is a massive, abstract number, but the paper trail Arthur and Chloe left behind was remarkably simple. Greed usually is. It makes people sloppy. It makes them arrogant. I didn't go to the courthouse for the reading of the verdict. I didn't need to sit in that suffocating room and smell the sour sweat of their panic. I sat on the balcony of my apartment, wrapped in a thick wool coat, watching the snow begin to fall over the city. I held my phone in my hand, waiting for Harrison's call. The city looked quiet from up here, peaceful. The traffic below was just a muted, rhythmic hum. I watched a single snowflake land on the dark screen of my phone and melt into a tiny drop of water. The screen lit up. The phone vibrated violently against my palm. Harrison. I answered it, pressing the cold glass to my ear. Tell me. Guilty, Harrison said. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion, a pure professional delivering the weather report. Guilty on all federal counts for both defendants. Conspiracy wire fraud, grand larceny, and the forgery of financial documents. I closed my eyes. The winter wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks. And the sentencing. Judge Higgins didn't wait. Harrison continued the faint sound of chaos, echoing through his end of the line. He handed it down immediately. Federal sentencing guidelines are rigid. Chloe got 10 years in a minimum security federal correctional institution. Arthur got 15 years in medium security, given he was the architect of the shell companies. 10 years. The number hit my chest like a physical blow. 10 years. That was my sentence. That was the exact amount of time I had been given. 10 years of eating gray food, of sleeping on a thin cot of coughing until I tasted iron, of watching my youth evaporate behind a chain-link fence. The timeline had corrected itself. The universe had balanced the scales. How did she react, I asked. My voice barely a whisper against the wind. She collapsed, Harrison said dryly, screaming, crying for her father. The bailiffs had to practically carry her out of the room. Arthur just stared straight ahead. I think his brain simply shut down. It was a circus, Clara. You were smart to stay away. And Richard, there was a brief pause on the line. Your father was in the back row. He looked like a corpse. The board officially voted him out of the company this morning, right before the verdict was read. The Beaumont estate is in foreclosure to pay off the restitution and the legal fees. He's bankrupt, Clara. He has nothing left. Richard Beaumont, the man who had built an empire on ruthless acquisitions and ignored his eldest daughter because she wasn't flashy enough. The man who had turned his back on me when I begged for my life. He was going to spend his twilight years living in a cramped apartment, entirely forgotten by the society he had worshipped. Thank you, Harrison, I said softly, for everything. Send me your final invoice. Take care of yourself, Clara, he replied. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone. I stood on the balcony for a long time, watching the snow accumulate on the railing. The silence in my apartment was absolute. Revenge is a strange, hollow thing. Books and movies tell you that it feels like a fiery triumph, an explosive release of joy. But it doesn't. It feels like cleaning out an old abandoned house. You drag all the rotting furniture out to the curb, you scrub the floors until your hands bleed, and when you're finally finished, you are just left standing in an empty room. I went inside and locked the balcony door. The heating kicked on a low, comforting hum. I walked into my kitchen and turned on the kettle. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door. I looked exactly the same as I had the night of the Founders' Gala. Young, unmarked. But behind my eyes, I was carrying a lifetime of ghosts. Arthur would rot in a cell. Chloe would lose her golden years to concrete and routine. Richard would die poor and alone. I had survived the crash. I had redirected the train. But as I poured the boiling water into my mug, watching the steam rise in twisting, chaotic spirals, a new, terrifying reality settled over me. For the first time since I opened my eyes in the Beaumont Hotel foyer, I didn't have a plan. I had spent every waking second of this second life orchestrating my survival and their destruction. I had built walls, secured assets, and laid traps. I had been a machine, programmed for one single purpose. Now the program was complete. The screen was blank. I walked over to the window and looked out at the sprawling, snowy city. Millions of lights flickered in the distance. Millions of lives happening all at once. I took a sip of the hot tea. The warmth spread down my throat, settling in my chest. I placed my hand flat against the cold glass of the window pane. I could feel my pulse beating in my fingertips. Strong, steady, alive. I didn't know what I was going to do tomorrow. I didn't know who I was going to be without the anger pushing me forward. But as I watched the snow bury the city, covering the dirt and the grime under a blanket of pure, untouched white, I finally smiled. I had 10 years to figure it out. 3 years is a long time when you are entirely free. It is a terrifyingly short time when you are locked in a cage. The rain was coming down in thick, gray sheets, turning the city sidewalks into slick mirrors. I sat in a booth at the back of a diner on 4th Street, nursing a cup of black coffee. It wasn't the high-end espresso I used to drink in the Beaumont Estate kitchens. It was bitter burnt and cost $2. I loved it. I flipped open the morning paper. I still preferred the physical copy. The ink stained my fingertips. Deep in the back pages, buried under local zoning disputes and minor stock fluctuations, was a 3-line obituary. Richard Beaumont, 68, former CEO of Beaumont Holdings, passed away Tuesday in his residence. There was no mention of a funeral service. There were no grieving relatives listed. He had died of a massive coronary in a rented 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. The landlord had found him 2 days later when the television was left blaring too loud. I stared at the small block of text. I waited for the grief. I waited for the guilt, the sharp sting of a daughter mourning her father. Nothing came. The man who had sold me out to protect his own reputation had died exactly the way he lived. Alone, surrounded by the noise of his own making. I folded the paper, left a $5 bill on the table, and walked out into the rain. My life now was quiet. I didn't attend galas. I didn't wear silk gowns, and I certainly didn't wear silver hairpins. I lived in a renovated loft in the industrial district, surrounded by exposed brick and thriving houseplants. And I worked. I walked 3 blocks to a nondescript office building and took the elevator to the 4th floor. The frosted glass door simply read, C. Beaumont Consulting. Agent Foster was already waiting in the lobby. She looked exactly the same as she had 3 years ago, tired sharp and draped in a cheap polyester suit. She was holding a damp umbrella and a cardboard tray of coffees. "You're late," Foster noted, handing me a cup. "Traffic." I lied, unlocking the inner office door. "Come in." My office was entirely devoid of personal touches. It was just a heavy oak desk, 2 computer monitors, and a white board covered in red marker lines connecting various offshore banking institutions. In my first life, I had gone to prison because I couldn't prove Arthur had forged the ledgers. In this life, I decided to make sure no one else ever suffered that same fate. I was a freelance forensic accountant. I tracked the money the feds couldn't find. I took the complex labyrinthine shell companies built by the ultra-rich and tore them down to the studs. Foster was my best client. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, tossing it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "The Harrison account," I said, booting up my computer. He funneled $12 million through a fake charity in Geneva, bounced it through 3 property holding firms in London, and parked it in a private trust in the Caymans. The account is under his wife's maiden name. The routing numbers are on page 4. Foster opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the top document. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "You are terrifying, Clara," Foster murmured, flipping to the next page. "We had 4 analysts looking at this for 6 months. They found nothing. You found it in 3 weeks. Your analysts look for legal anomalies," I replied, sitting down and taking a sip of the coffee she brought. "I look for human arrogance. Rich men always make the same mistake. They think they are smarter than the paper trail. They aren't." Foster closed the folder and tucked it under her arm. "This is enough for a warrant. We'll freeze his assets by noon." She paused at the door, looking back at me. Her expression softened just a fraction. Arthur Pendleton's appeal was denied yesterday. The appellate judge refused to even hear oral arguments. He's serving the full 15. I didn't blink. "Good to know." "And your sister." "I don't have a sister, Agent Foster." Foster nodded slowly. She understood. She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. "I'll wire your consulting fee by the end of the week." "Good work, Clara." When the door clicked shut, the office fell completely silent. I turned to my desk. Nestled next to my keyboard was a stack of mail my assistant had brought up that morning. Most of it was Bill's bank statements and junk. But right in the middle was a standard-issue federal penitentiary envelope. The return address belonged to the Women's Correctional Facility upstate. The handwriting was frantic, jagged, and painfully familiar. "Chloe Beaumont, inmate number 8, 4932. It was the 5th letter she had sent this year. I knew exactly what it said without opening it. It would be a frantic, tear-soaked plea. She would beg me to hire Harrison to appeal her case. She would talk about how terrible the food was, how mean the guards were, how she didn't belong there. She would say she was sorry, not because she regretted betraying me, but because she regretted getting caught. I picked up the envelope. It felt incredibly light. It held absolutely no power over me. I didn't open it. I didn't tear it up in a fit of rage. I simply walked over to the small paper shredder in the corner of my office, turned it on, and fed the letter into the metal teeth. The machine whirred, grinding the paper into tiny, illegible strips. I walked to the window and looked down at the street below. The rain had stopped. The clouds were finally breaking, letting a sharp, brilliant beam of sunlight cut through the gray, hitting the wet pavement and turning it to gold. I was 25 years old. My bank accounts were full. My conscience was clear. My past was finally dead and buried. I smiled, turned away from the window, and went back to work. That's the end of Clara's story. A stark reminder that the best revenge isn't destroying someone else. It's letting their own greed do the heavy lifting while you walk away completely free. If you felt that cold, satisfying chill when Clara fed that final letter into the shredder, hit that like button right now. Do you think Chloe deserved her 10-year sentence? Or was she just a pawn in Arthur's game? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a good revenge story, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human-gripping audio dramas every single week.